As I was exploring various disappearances, I stumbled upon a series of strange cases that occurred in Texas back in 2012. The circumstances surrounding these incidents take an eerie turn as the details unravel. What makes this even more puzzling is that despite extensive investigations, none of these cases have been explained, and they all transpired within a relatively short distance and time frame of one another. It's disconcerting to think that individuals can vanish without a trace, leaving behind a void that seems impossible to fill or even understand. In this particular scenario, the vanishing of several people in such a small time frame raises a lot of red flags. It's quite alarming how the events unfolded, and it's even more concerning that there's still no explanation as to what happened to these individuals. For 3 families waiting for answers, the forbidding woods and bogs of North Liberty County seem to have swallowed their fathers last year without leaving a trace. How can people be swallowed whole and never be seen again like this? "This is crazy," said Kimberly Rogers, whose father, Dennis, was the last of the 3 men to disappear nearly 10 months ago. Before we explore Dennis's disappearance, let's go back to the beginning. The first to vanish under bizarre circumstances was 62-year-old and disabled trucker Edwin Rogers. Edwin lived in Liberty County, and while there isn't much information published about Edwin specifically, I believe that he was a veteran, and on the day in question, which was the 30th of December 2011, he'd spoke to his brother and asked if he'd like to accompany him to the town's Veterans Hall. His brother seems to have been busy that day and declined, which only in hindsight would that be very unfortunate, and perhaps this whole incident could have been avoided in other circumstances. This conversation between the brothers though would be the last time anyone ever heard or saw Edwin again. The following day, on the 31st, right before the new year, Edwin's wife and stepson both saw his green Jeep on the side of Texas 213 near County Road 2243. Between Cleveland and Tarkenton Prairie. The pair went to investigate the vehicle. His cellular phone and medication were still inside the vehicle. Multiple searches have been conducted by the Liberty County Sheriff's Office and EquiSearch, to include air and ground searches. Unfortunately, even with all of the resources expended thus far, Edwin remains missing. What's particularly of interest here is the fact that Edwin was considered disabled and had bad legs, so he wasn't able to walk very far. So the immediate question would be, if that's the case, why was he nowhere to be found in the general vicinity? If it's not a realistic proposal to suggest that he walked well out of the area, what went down that day? People seem to be surprised at this and weren't sure how he could have left the area on foot. This search for Edwin was fairly extensive in scope and, as said, had ground and air elements alongside dogs who never picked up his scent. Investigators are still searching for clues in the case of missing Tarkenton resident Edwin Rogers. Investigators arranged for members of Texas EquiSearch to help pursue a place of interest on foot Friday morning, but nothing was found. Evans said this area of interest was a patch of disturbed ground that was searched with ground-penetrating radar, proved unfruitful. Needless to say, but this didn't work, and a further search of the area didn't uncover anything either. Many years later, in 2018, some bones were found in a wooded area in the general vicinity, but they didn't belong to Edwin. And ultimately, no signs have ever been discovered over 10 years later now from the initial disappearance. The second person to vanish under unusual circumstances was Mark Reinberger, who disappeared around a month and a half after Edwin, whose disappearance still continues to baffle investigators. On the day of Mark's disappearance, the 15th of February 2012, also just happened to be his birthday. Mark was a welder who lived in Crosby, and apparently he'd been displaying unusual behaviour during the build-up to this event. At 5 AM that morning, Mark got up, left his home, and got in his 2005 white Chevrolet truck, where he then set off. His daughter, Amanda, would later state that Mark rushed from his home, leaving his wallet behind. Over the course of the next couple of hours, Mark drove to 2 gas stations and told attendants that he believed that he was being stalked and pursued by someone, but he didn't or wasn't able to extrapolate on this at all. He didn't make it known why he felt this way or what he'd observed to come to that conclusion. In any case, 2 hours after rushing from his home and reaching the gas stations, at 7 AM, his car collided with a dilapidated house near the Trinity River Bridge. People were on the scene quickly to check on the driver, but upon inspection, there was no one in the car and Mark had vanished. The key was still in the ignition, and there were no clear signs to indicate what might have happened to him, but it sure appears suspicious and just odd that moments before he felt that another presence was watching him. Who this may have been, or just what was going on at that time, will likely never be understood now. The people rushed to the scene, then called the sheriff to explain what had just happened. And he and his deputies arrived and began searching the perimeter, which included the forest areas too. They found no trace of him that day, and Mark hadn't left any indications on the ground of which direction he took. Over the course of a few weeks, the investigation grew in size and volunteers were out looking for him, alongside other people who were just being mindful and keeping an eye out as they travelled the area. The investigation continued for weeks after this, but in all that time there were no discoveries whatsoever. That was until the 6th week. 6 weeks later, Mark's jacket with his cell phone in the pocket was found a few miles away near a remote gravel pit, authorities said. This gave the authorities a new focus point, and this quarry area was searched, but nothing else was ever uncovered, and the findings never led to Mark, and how his items even got there was never explained. I'm sure that you can imagine in a case like this, but rumours began to run wild. Investigators also tracked down rumours overheard at a bar and posted on Facebook that Mark had been taken on a ride from which he would never return, but could never substantiate them. It's hard to even know what to think about that. After investigations, it looks like the authorities didn't seem to think that there was anything to that other than pure rumours and people speculating. This lack of leads led many to state that they believed that there was an element of foul play involved, while others have suggested that he may have staged his own disappearance. I can certainly see why people would conclude that there may have been foul play. Mark felt that he was being followed, and then to hear rumours like that. The authorities did question some people in the area and had a confrontation with 3 people in a trailer, but ultimately it didn't lead anywhere, and it seems that the authorities couldn't find any evidence that suggested that they had any involvement. His family seemed to believe that Mark was fleeing someone that day. Now, 21 days after Mark disappeared, a man by the name of Dennis Rogers, unrelated to Edwin Rogers, disappeared 9 miles away on the 8th of March 2012. Dennis was an electrician for Shell Oil, but sadly had experienced a serious medical event 5 years prior that left him with short-term memory loss, and at times made him somewhat confused and disoriented. As a result of this, he was in constant contact with his daughter, Crystal, who was always there for her father. The pair would call each other frequently throughout the day, as Crystal liked to make sure that he was okay, and usually this seemed to be the case. Despite Dennis's medical event those years prior, as far as I can tell, it seems that he was able to maintain a fairly high level of autonomy, and he would take frequent walks outdoors near his home and near the woods which were close by too. This time though would be different. On Thursday, Dennis entered the woods in the area. Once in the woods, which was close to 3:30 PM, he became lost. When his daughter called him on his cell phone is when it was determined he was no longer on his daily walk but actually lost in the woods. Crystal obviously became highly concerned during this phone call, and Dennis told her that he was in the middle of pine trees and on a trail. Crystal got in her vehicle and drove down to the wooded area that she believed he may have been and began sounding the horn of her car, but there was no response from Dennis. Dennis's family then rushed to local law enforcement so they could use their phone to help locate him, and weirdly, they did get a ping on the phone, and they began to move in on the specified location, which was now in the middle of thousands of acres of the wooded area. When they reached this location, they couldn't find Dennis anywhere. Friday afternoon, a bloodhound with Precinct 4 was put on the ground at Mr. Rogers' home. Oliver picked up a track and led deputies deep into the woods before he lost it. Friday night, Texas Department tracking dogs were put on the ground at the same location, but they too lost the trail. It's interesting that the dogs were able to pick up the scent initially before losing it. Now, at this point, and rather suddenly, the weather started to take a turn for the worse and temperatures began to drop. The harsh downpour of rain completely prevented air support from going up, and four-wheelers now began to get stuck in the forest. The conditions present also began to affect phone signals, which meant that they now had an even more difficult time trying to ping Dennis's phone. His last known position was thought to have been in a very dense forested area near a large swamp, and despite the conditions, it was said that there were over 150 people out in the forest desperately trying to reach him. The problem was, despite the pings, they just couldn't find him at all. Let's hear a little more about this. Dennis initially didn't want to call police as he thought this might land him in a retirement home or something similar. His former wife finally convinced him to call the police close to 8:30 p.m. She then had to go to the police department to physically be there for them to ping his phone to locate it. She arrived and found the officer that could do it had just been dispatched on a call and once again had to wait for his return. When he was reached on the phone, he was not in a panic. He just told the dispatchers he had become lost. From 8:30 p.m. until a few minutes after 1 a.m, they were able to get locates on his phone. Then it stopped. Officials feel that the battery ran out. The last two pings were within a very short distance from each other, and all but one was along a roadway used by hunters and loggers. The United States Coast Guard was called in an attempt to locate him using thermal imagery, but they were unsuccessful in almost an hour that they were there. They were forced to leave the area due to rains moving in and low fuel levels. At 4 a.m. that morning, Dennis's footprints were found near his last known ping location, but they led nowhere before disappearing. This disappearance was absolutely baffling to everyone involved, and it must have been so frustrating to have his location, find the footprints, but then he's just nowhere to be found. Then the weather gets worse quickly and they have to pause. Because of how bizarre things were looking, rumours began to spread about foul play, and the authorities again investigated these rumours. But as far as I can tell, no one was arrested, so I can only assume there was no evidence of this present. About a year on, again, bones were found in this general area, but they didn't belong to Dennis. Liberty County Sheriff's spokesman, Captain Rex Evans, said they are investigating the cases, but haven't found anything to indicate that they're connected. Nevertheless, it has fueled paranoia in this remote area about 90 minutes northeast of Houston, in many parts impenetrable by thick forest. It's difficult to know what to make of all that. It's very odd to have 3 people go missing and never be found in such a short time span and distance from one another. It's also odd that rumours and suspicions of foul play kept cropping up, of which there was never any actionable evidence for it, it seems. That was basically all of the information that I could find for these events, and as said, they all remain unexplained and without any real conclusions. Now, at this point, this next disappearance is not connected in any way to the previous 3, and also occurred many years prior, but it's still interesting and also worth sharing in this video. That being the strange case of Dr. Robert North, a 35-year-old physician who went missing in Big Bend National Park in 1947. Dr. North was a brilliant individual who had earned his Doctor of Medicine degree in Michigan and enjoyed a successful career as a physician for many years. However, in 1946, he began experiencing health issues and decided to leave medicine behind to pursue his passion for photography. Perhaps he believed that this career shift would help manage the stress that might have exacerbated his heart condition. Dr. North visited the national park on the 5th of June that year for a well-needed rest after suffering from a heart attack just 3 days prior. Thankfully, it wasn't a major attack, but no heart attack is good news, and he took this as a warning sign that he needed to begin reducing stress in his life. 2 days later, on the 7th, would be the last time that he would ever be seen again. And this was near the cabin he'd rented within the park, roughly 70 miles south of Marathon. His disappearance was not reported until June 14, when his cabin, containing over $600, over $8,000 today in camera equipment, as well as other articles, was discovered abandoned. He was last seen when he left his cabin on June 7 to buy food for his boxer dog, Tuffy. It's not completely clear to me who reported him missing, as he was at the rest camp alone with Tuffy, while his wife and family remained in Monaghan's. Perhaps when his family hadn't heard from him, they went to look for him, but it wasn't mentioned. In any case, it seems that the searchers believed that they would find him relatively quickly, or at the very least a sign of him, Tuffy, or his car that he drove on the 7th. This wasn't the case though, despite having several experienced Texan pilots in the air and many boots on the ground, including bloodhounds. They found no evidence of his presence anywhere, and the dogs never found a scent to indicate a direction of travel. At this stage, authorities shared more details about Robert's last known position. Later, on the 7th, Robert showed up at Lupe's store below Terlingua, and some distance from park headquarters, where he asked about dog food. The next day, officers found after investigation he registered at Balmoria State Park, about 55 miles north of Alpine. The press went quiet for a time before stating on the 28th of July that Robert had been missing for 7 weeks now, and still no clues had been unearthed at all. Of course, the official search had long since come to a close at this point, but local ranchers still made efforts to search while they were working their land. Now, I thought that was the end of the paper trail, but I was wrong. In September of 1951, something unexpected happened. Mystery surrounding the disappearance of Dr. Robert North 4 years ago deepened today with a physician's report that bones found near the missing man's abandoned car were animal bones. A car found in Big Bend National Park Canyon last week had been identified as the car Dr. North was driving when he disappeared. Many found it odd that the car hadn't been spotted sooner during the initial searches, which led to questions and speculations of foul play. The insinuation being that the car may have been moved afterwards, though there was no real evidence of this. Secondly, initially people thought that the bones found belonged to Tuffy, but later this was also realised to not be the case. The bones were definitely not human, said Mrs. North. Since his disappearance, his wife has continuously tried to learn exactly what happened to her husband. A ground party found that the North car, identified from papers locked in the glove compartment, was 200 yards off of the Arroyo Road. The key was in the switch, turned off. Based off this information, authorities came to the conclusion that in all likelihood, Robert had planned to return to the car promptly, but obviously this never happened. Park rangers were also placed on the scene to help figure out exactly what went on that day, and they began to search all of the possible routes leading from the abandoned car, but there was no indication of Robert's presence on any of the trails. Park Superintendent Ross G. Maxwell said a complete search of the area is being made. A final examination of Dr. North's car showed he had spent considerable time trying to extricate his car from the bed of the arroyo. The front of the car had apparently been stopped by a large boulder, and a flat rock had been placed in front of the left wheel to elevate it over the boulder. Skid chains had been used and apparently slipped off. It was further apparent that Dr. North expected to return to the car in a short time because he left the keys in the ignition switch. It is also believed that he gave up trying to extricate the car when the rear tyre blew out. So, clearly Robert was having problems that day and managed to get his car stuck. It's not clear at all why he left the vicinity of the car or what he was doing in the meantime. As said, the keys were still in the ignition, and this led the authorities and rangers alike in agreement that this probably meant that Robert fully intended to return to the car to have another go at getting it free. Interestingly, they weren't able to identify the bones around the car and so sent them to the FBI to be analysed. Nothing more was ever said about this, other than Dr. Ross Maxwell, the superintendent, stating, "The bones are those of a beast." This was never expanded upon, except for confirming that they weren't toughies. You might think that this would have been nice to know, but they just never said anything else about the bones after that. At this point also, Mrs. North began to grow dismayed at the whole ordeal and didn't understand how the car could have gone unnoticed for all this time, making the point that it should have been found initially. She then went on to accuse the park of failing to search thoroughly. It's understandable why she was feeling this way, and an explanation as to how the car was missed during the initial ground and aerial searches was never offered. The authorities kept repeating the line that there was no evidence of foul play, but I have to wonder if that's the way Mrs. North was leaning with their suspicions. She certainly thought that this whole incident seemed unusual or off somehow. She kept filing requests for the FBI to conduct a serious investigation into the whole incident themselves, but this never came to fruition. Ultimately, despite continued searching of the area for weeks after the car was discovered, nothing else was ever found. No clothing, no remains, nothing. None of the questions were ever answered, and it's not known what happened to Dr. North or his dog. That, also, as far as I can tell, is the end of the paper trail, and I wasn't able to find anything else. What do you think happened? At this point, it's time to end this video and hand it over to you in the comments below. I'd also just like to shout out a friend of mine here on YouTube, Kirk Jones. He's an ex-Marine that wanted to make some videos and give tips on how to stay safe in wilderness areas. His videos are well worth a watch, so I'll link one at the top right of the screen now and in the description if you want to have a look. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.